Grand Duke Archentar, with a restrained gesture strictly dictated by etiquette, invited the guests to the table. Lath and Meredith took their seats on either side of the host, each carefully ensuring they did not move faster than the other. However, the atmosphere quickly became more relaxed. The envoy requested to be served by his own slaves, only they knew what he could and could not eat. As the guest of honor, it was also his duty to initiate the conversation. Lath knew exactly what would pique the host's interest.
"And how are things going with your trade, my esteemed host?" he began. "I've heard rumors that by lowering customs duties, you've taken the lion's share of commerce from the eastern states."
"A lion's share?" Archentar murmured. "That's quite an exaggeration."
"Well, but you have announced a new levy."
"You said—"
Archentar nodded.
"That trade impacts the army."
He turned to Meredith.
"Did I misunderstand?"
"No, my lord,"
Meredith replied.
"If trade collapses, the eastern states won't be able to pay their soldiers' wages. The army will turn against its impoverished rulers, for trade is their strength, their only true source of wealth."
"Could you explain that, sir?"
Achaja interjected.
"Those countries are extremely wealthy, or so I've heard."
"Exactly.
Lath smiled at her.
If trade collapses, the majority of their income will vanish."
"How strange," Achaja said, still puzzled. "A country has income and expenses like some merchant? Surely they're too rich to lose revenue and income."
She hesitated briefly, searching for the right word.
"Yes,"
the imperial envoy said, unable to resist a subtle jab at Achaja.
"the wealth of the eastern states does stem from their wealth, indeed."
"But the army and trade,
Meredith frowned.
isn't it a bit much to connect those two? Wealth comes from the land."
"Then why does Linoy maintain a port at Daugher? A tiny rock lost in the sea, where nothing grows. Everything must be brought in by ship. Maintaining that port costs a fortune. Why do they keep it?"
No one spoke. Maintaining the port at Daugher was widely regarded as the eccentricity of the old Prince of Linoy, but no one dared voice this opinion aloud at an official banquet, even when there were no subjects of Linoy present to hear it.
"To control the nearby straits," Achaja suddenly said. "They keep the port so warships can be stationed there. Without their consent, no one can pass through the straits between the seas."
"That's nonsense,"
Achaja interjected. Everyone knows Linoy doesn't charge customs or tolls for passage through the straits. Even if they did, the revenues wouldn't cover the costs of maintaining the port. She recalled similar discussions from her father's court.
"What do you say to that, my lady?"
Meredith asked Achaja.
"They do it because they gain more profit from trade than from customs or tolls. The straits are gold from the mountains, our grain and wool, the craftsmanship of the west, cattle from the south, and iron from the north. All trade now flows through Linoy's cities. If anyone tries to establish trading posts near the straits, Linoy will block them immediately, and we'll have a second wind war. In that war, a small duchy defeated a vast tyranny by cutting off its supply of goods entirely."
"Silence, you fool!"
Achaja hissed, irritated by her stepdaughter's eloquent reply.
"My lady,"
Meredith inclined his head slightly toward Achaja.
"I feel great admiration for your tutors."
"Then your admiration,"
Achaja said with a faint smile,
"is primarily due to Lady Achaja, who spares no effort in educating me."
Lath and Meredith barely managed to stifle their laughter. Lath even placed a hand over his mouth, as if afraid it might betray him. Meredith, more composed, twisted his lips into a smirk and fixed his gaze on his wine goblet, as though it had suddenly revealed some fascinating secret. Even Archentar felt a renewed respect for his daughter, who had managed to insult Achaja under the guise of delivering a compliment. This child was truly alive, intelligent and sharp. Perhaps he could spare her from military service. Perhaps he could name her as his successor. Archentar could not have known that what he saw as a minor decision in his life would carry such profound consequences for the world. He had no idea that, in this very moment, the fate of an entire civilization, its history balanced at a critical juncture, was hanging in the scales of his mind. But Archentar was not a man who easily reversed a decision once made. Without realizing it, he rejected the opportunity to alter the course of destiny. History would not remember him, would not record him in its annals, not even as an honorable old man who valued his state above all else, even above the fate of his own family. The image he so desperately wished to uphold in his own eyes. Archentar faded into obscurity at the exact moment he dismissed the thought of preventing Achaja's military service. Driven by his misguided sense of exaggerated justice, he resolved instead to punish his daughter.
Achaja,
Archentar said, convincing himself that this was also to protect his daughter from his wife's wrath.
you will spend the rest of the feast standing.
Achaja rose swiftly, bowing her head. Meredith glanced at the host from the corner of his eye. Even Lath raised his eyebrows in surprise, yet etiquette allowed not a single comment on the severity of the host's customs.
My lord.
The old cook approached the table and clumsily dropped to his knees. His bulk made it increasingly difficult for him to comply with such ceremonial demands. Yet he was a master whose occasional lapses were forgiven and who could expect a peaceful retirement someday, perhaps with a small estate, or even his own village among his lord's lands.
Very well, begin.
Archentar said, clapping his hands. They ate in silence. The young women at the table stole only furtive glances at the slaves who had entered with the cook and were now serving Lath. Both girls were scared. Both were practically naked, each one wearing only a kind of apron. Even Archentar was moved. Although he'd heard about the Empire's customs related to slavery, he wondered how to ask about such a degree of the women's humiliation not to offend his guest. His hesitation was cut by Lath himself.
Apologies. I see the sight of my slaves arouses disdain.
Not at all.
I know the customs of the kingdom of Troy. They are honored even on our side of the border. I know that no woman can be seen half naked.
They are completely naked, Meredith interjected.
Yes, but those are no women. Those are slaves, non-humans.
The envoy explained calmly.
It's as if you allowed dogs into this chamber. They also don't wear clothes.
And
Archentar felt his cheeks blush.
why do they maintain this awkward grimace?
Ah, it's the security measure. Every slave is branded on a buttock, and a special gag is placed into her mouth that prevents them from talking or moving her tongue. They cannot even ask for help.
Terrible, muttered Meredith.
They are just slaves.
Both girls at the table were terrified. Achaja, however, eventually overcame herself to the point she could barely suppress a smile, imagining Achaja in such clothing and gagged. The thought amused her immensely, especially since the princess seemed entirely unfazed by the punishment of standing at the table. Achaja handled the modern fork with the precision of a seasoned warrior wielding a sword. Not a single morsel fell onto the table. After a moment, the head cook reappeared in the dining hall. This time, he bowed without even pretending to make an effort to kneel. Archentar, who held him in high regard, not so much because he himself was a glutton, but for the way excellent food affected his guests, smiled at him. Raising his hand, he signaled for silence in the hall.
Fetch the finest wine from the cellar,"
he commanded, as etiquette required. The wine had long been prepared in the kitchen, but it was the head cook's duty to deliver it personally. When he returned, carrying a large jug, Archentar gestured toward his daughter. Custom dictated that the first cup of wine be drunk by the least significant person at the table. To fulfill this requirement, every feast was attended by a few so-called distant relatives, people who had no right to speak, who were ignored and treated as though invisible. Their sole purpose was to taste the first cups of wine, so that no one of even marginal importance had to endure this humiliating duty, and to take the blame for any overly loud belches or, heaven forbid, flatulence from official guests. Yes, yes. Everyone still remembers how Prince of Linoy's persistent whins during a banquet sparked a nearly 20-year war between his princedom and Sim tyranny. These individuals were often not even true relatives. In extreme cases, someone from an impoverished noble family could be hired for the role, and with a single stroke of the court herald's quill, they would be declared a member of the family. Now, however, Archentar pointed to his daughter. Was he punishing her for handling herself so well, even while standing? For her earlier sharp words to her stepmother? But it was a punishment too severe. Meredith froze in surprise, and even Lath glanced at the girl to confirm that it was indeed the host's daughter. Achaja suppressed a smile. The cook, usually indifferent to matters of etiquette, approached Achaja with such agonizing slowness that it seemed mere moments would separate him from a whipping. Yet Achaja bravely raised her cup. Despite his bulk, the cook knelt and carefully filled her goblet. Meredith and Achaja froze as the girl lifted the wine to her lips. Meredith, because he liked her and didn't want a careless complaint from her to lead to even greater humiliation in his presence. Achaja, on the other hand, hoped Achaja would make a mistake, giving her the perfect opportunity to react. But a faint smile appeared on the princess's face. For a moment, she weighed in her mind just how far she could go. Then she lifted the crystal goblet to her lips and drained its contents in one great gulp, tilting her head back dramatically. It was her revenge on her father, letting the guests think, if only for a moment, that he had raised a rabid drunkard of a daughter. The head cook turned greener than even Archentar himself, a princely child gulping wine like a sailor in port. Such an insult, such a slap in the face to the guests, such a disgrace hurled directly at envoy Lath. The cook silently bade farewell to his life. Achaja couldn't believe her luck, and Lath wondered if he could declare war immediately, or if he had to wait for the emperor's approval.
"Oh,"
Achaja said in a sweet voice.
"This wine is so exquisite and so strong that I became intoxicated just by its aroma."
The tension in Archentar deflated like a punctured bladder. Achaja, on the other hand, sucked in air with an audible hiss. Meredith chuckled, and Lath felt a wave of relief. Wine so refined it intoxicates by scent alone? An insult had suddenly transformed into a compliment for the guests. The sorcerer smiled at the girl. This little one is truly clever, he thought. Lath began clapping his hands, convinced that the entire spectacle had been a ploy between the host and his daughter, a small reprieve from the monotony of official banquets. Only the cook, miraculously spared from the blade, was unable to pour the remaining cups of wine, his hands trembling too much to hold the jug steady. The diners, unlike the princess, merely wetted their lips. The time for heavy drinking would come, but at the beginning of a feast, custom dictated a more restrained demeanor.
You know,
Lath resumed the political discussion, aware that as the guest of honor, it was still his duty to keep the conversation flowing.
there are lands where the very concepts of honor and dignity are non-existent.
Take the northern countries, for instance, muttered Meredith, shrugging.
Oh no, no. However vile and pitiful, they still hold to some semblance of honor.
Are there lands with even baser customs?
The Grand Duke asked, genuinely surprised. He was, after all, responsible for the diplomacy of the Kingdom of Troy, yet he had never heard of anything cruder than the ways of the North.
Oh, indeed there are, Lath replied, stroking his neatly trimmed beard. I speak of the sick people from beyond the great forest.
The West, Archentar vaguely recalled. That's where we get artisan goods and...
He struggled to remember what else.
The great forest. I've heard it's not all that great, Meredith remarked skeptically.
Alas, Master Sorcerer, Lath countered, it's really vast, impassable.
Then how do their goods reach us?
By sea or through the northern mountains? It drives up the price, of course, but through the forest? Number. Impossible.
The Grand Duke nodded.
Why then, Sir Imperial Envoy, do you call them people without honor?
Ah!
Lath settled more comfortably in his chair and sipped his wine.
I once served as envoy to King Hemenroy. My ship docked in the magnificent port fortress of Hem, named after the king himself. I was preparing to travel inland to the capital when I was delayed, informed that I might witness a great battle. The next day, just as the scouts from the privateer ships had foretold, the fleet of the sick people appeared on the horizon. Ah, fleet is such a generous term. A collection of boats, really, with a handful of smaller trading vessels mixed in. The ships of Hem attacked them, wreaking devastation. In less than half a day, all those vessels were interlocked, smoke rising to the skies, leaving me disappointed, as there was no battle, just a slaughter.
And they didn't surrender?
Ha!
The Imperial Envoy slammed his hand on the table.
There was no one left to surrender. I thought it was over for them. All their ships burned after being boarded. But the sick people, instead of being taken captive, leapt into the water.
But surely they were caught on the shore.
Lath shook his head.
Listen, good sirs. I stood on the shore on the port walls. I saw everything. Those shipwrecked souls swam toward the harbor.
What do you mean? Swam?
Of course. Many of them made it to the sandbar, where the merchant boats were hauled up. I was about to leave. Why watch the execution? But they...
The envoy took another sip of wine.
When they reached the shore, they drew their swords and began cutting down the crowd that had gathered.
Meredith, well-traveled as he was, grimaced with disgust.
Surely the soldiers scattered them in no time, Archentar asked.
What soldiers? The army was fighting the battle at sea. The guards struck back, of course, but it was chaos. Panicked shouting, a mob surging in every direction. They couldn't reach them. The crowd rushed toward the gates, and the sick people went with them, stabbing women alongside anyone else.
The gates were not closed?
How? The mob was fleeing into the city. How to raise the bridge when 200 peasants are charging across it? No one could manage at the wheel, and the ropes would have snapped.
And the sick people among the crowd.
Precisely. The streets cleared a bit. The guards cornered a few of the drowned ones, but the rest, they broke into an inn, barred the doors, and started doing what they pleased with the innkeeper's family. The guards laid siege to the place, but the invaders just laughed and carried on. In the end, the soldiers set the inn on fire. That's when the mob really turned against them. They started cursing the guards' colors and pelting them with stones. With such fury, mind you, that the guards had to retreat. The officers ran to the castle waiting for orders.
What to do? And the mayor was in the temple at the time. Someone stabbed him right on the steps.
Sick people?
And who else? The commander of the guard barely managed to mount his horse when someone slashed him with a sword, and down he went, bleeding out on the ground. The guards tore the brigand who did it to shreds. His clothes were still soaked, for all to see. But how to carry on? Who to take command? Meanwhile, houses are burning. The common rabble proceeds to riot. Priests are lying dead in temples, sent off to their gods by an unknown offender. Houses, warehouses, exchange points are being looted. Sick people? Or perhaps just common folk emboldened by the chaos? Then the guard rushed to the prince's palace to make a stand against the invaders. At first, by the shouting and calls, it seemed like the prince himself might be stepping out onto the stairs. But no, it was some lout from the sick people, wearing a bloodied and torn princely cloak. He was guzzling that colorless, reeking wine of theirs, spitting and jeering, cursing everyone and everything around him. The guard charged, but before they reached him, he shouted out that the prince's riches now belonged to everyone, that there was no power left in him. After that, it was trampling and looting and fires everywhere. But it wasn't the sick people who orchestrated that. There was no hem anymore. When I slipped out through the gates in the dead of night, the sick people were announcing there would be no more tolls, no more taxes, that everyone could now be their own master. They established their own rule. From the hills, I managed to catch a glimpse of them throwing dissenters off the city walls.
They lost the battle, yet captured the city?
Lath nodded sadly.
Not by the power of arms, but by filth. They have no command, no order, but they bite like rabid dogs. Once they sink their teeth in, life isn't enough to sate them.
Of everyone at the table, only Achaja noticed the shift in the envoy's speech. The court chronicler and calligraphy master had often taught her to pay attention to how people speak. Everyone speaks plainly, of course, but differently. Peasants one way, merchants another, and lords yet another. That wasn't the point. People spoke one way in everyday life, but what they said was written down differently in chronicles. If someone suddenly starts speaking in chronicler's language, princess, her calligraphy teacher had once explained, it means either they're recounting something they didn't personally experience, or they did experience it long ago and have since dictated it to chroniclers who immortalized it, and then read their own words, as if they were someone else's. And you know, princess, he'd added with a wry smile, if people ever start writing just as they speak, without changing a thing, they'll read our stories and wonder what a strange way of speaking we all had. Meredith nodded somberly.
Indeed. I've encountered the sick people myself. Only a few dozen, though.
Where was that? Archentar asked with interest. Do tell us about it, Master Sorcerer.
If I won't bore my audience.
Meredith swept his gaze over the gathered company, but naturally no one voiced any objections.
It was during the renewal of vows by the tyrant of Sim. In the city of Heberon, also a port, he added, glancing at the envoy.
Lath allowed himself a faint smile.
The sick people never conquered it.
Oh no, no. They were even defending it. But to the point, it was a peculiar ceremony indeed. The armies of Linoy had been besieging Heberon for a year. The 20-year war was drawing to a close. Sim was already choking under the weight of war costs, yet the tyrant spared no expense. I had never seen a feast like it before. Heaps of extravagant dishes piled up to the ceilings of the old palace. Guests, delegations from across the world, resplendent garments, princes. Even the servants outnumbered the guests. And outside the windows, a rabble killing one another, just to gnaw on the discarded scraps.
People? Archentar asked in surprise. Not dogs.
All the dogs had long been eaten during the siege. It was a strange feast. The armies of Linoy stormed the walls, the guests reveled in opulence, and just a step away, commoners butchered each other, women and children alike, to suck the marrow from even a long-gnawed bone. A dreadful night. Fire on the walls, blood beneath the windows, music within the palace.
And what about the sick people? Lath inquired.
Ah, well, the tyrant had gathered many curiosities. There were strange birds, peacocks more splendid than the honor guard. There were elephants, so large they had to dismantle 2 walls of the palace to bring them inside. There were peculiar flowers that caught insects like animals with jaws. And there were the sickly folk. The tyrant brought 40 of them, paying their leader to make rumble and create smoke.
What did they make, pardon me? Lath asked, not catching the word.
Rumble. You see, they all carried long pipes, muskets, or whatever their name was. And when they all lined up against the wall at once, they made a rumble and smoke so great that pieces of the ceiling fell on the guests.
Well, well, Archentar muttered. Perhaps it's for the better that Sim Tyrant lost. Entertaining guests with falling ceilings can be done without the sick people.
And it'd cost less than with a banquet, Lath laughed.
Such opinions were exchanged between the various princes on that banquet as well, Meredith continued. They fired their muskets, made their rumble, and left. The tyrant's grand surprise wasn't particularly successful.
The sorcerer paused to take a sip from his goblet before continuing.
The next morning, the armies of Linoy breached the walls. The streets were filled with chaos, violence, panic, and cries everywhere. Fire raged through burning houses, and smoke choked the air. The palace was taken, and soldiers reportedly trampled over guests lying sprawled on the floors, never having made it to their rooms. I don't know for sure. I was already running toward the port, but there, it was even worse. An uproar, everyone scrambling onto ships, desperate to flee, to get away. The tyrant's own guards cut down common folk with their swords just to clear a path for their ruler. The crowd fell by the swords of their own defenders. A bloodbath. But the way was cleared. I managed to board a ship, paying the captain enough to buy 2 villages, and we tried to set sail along with countless other ships. But the water was crowded, throng as if on a village festival. Archers from Sim's warships shot mercilessly at anyone in their path. I'm looking at the shore, and I see Linoy's troops entering the port. Perfectly disciplined, their formation unbroken, not a single step mistaken. It was a frightening beauty to behold, the sheer precision of it, the menace in their steadiness. And out of a tavern, one left untouched so far, stumbled the sick people. Yesterday's spectacle, bright jackets, colorful trousers admired as curiosities, now disheveled and torn, clearly after the whole night of drinking. One vomiting against a wall, another's relieving themselves in plain sight, someone dunking his head into a fountain. Their stench reached me even on the ship, worse than a cobbler after a heavy meal in the amphitheater. An utter disgrace, an utter opprobrium. And the prince's troops started advancing on them. All young men, their armor gleaming, helmets adorned with plumes, marching in perfect unison. It was a breathtaking sight, their oiled limbs glinting in the sun, their polished greaves, shields, and swords shining. Someone began rallying the sick people, who reluctantly started to gather, some still on shaking legs, and prepared their weapons. The prince's soldiers drew closer, and it was clear they'd obliterate them in moments. 200 elite troops against, 40 scoundrels.
And then?
Lath couldn't contain his curiosity.
Sick people arranged themselves, somehow. In lines, if you could call them lines, irregular and jagged. Here, Linoy boys, here drunken pigs.
Meredith took another swig.
And they made a rumble again. First line moved back, revealing the second. They made a rumble as well and moved back, revealing the third, which did the same. And the prince's army, covered in blood, soldiers falling down. And it was no longer that glamorous regiment. Only people that screamed, people lying on the ground, and people taking to their feet like rabbits.
What?
Archentar snorted.
200 fled before the 40.
Wheel!
Lath interponed.
A regiment cramped in a narrow port alley. On a real battlefield, they would have succeeded effortlessly.
Certainly so,
Meredith responded.
but these were no longer the same people you saw, sire, in the city of Hem. Drunk, wretched, but obeying commands.
And what next?
Achaja blurted out.
Nothing next?
Meredith replied with a faint smirk.
The sick people made their way to my ship, asking for rescue. The captain let them aboard, fearing they'd fire at him if he didn't. And somehow, we managed to sail out of the port.
Ha!
Archentar slammed his hand on the table.
So they fled after all.
Indeed.
Lath joined in, nodding solemnly.
What times we live in when a mere commoner can dare aim a crossbow or, what's it called, a musket at a knight. Nothing but the downfall of decency and the end of culture.
True, very true,
The Grand Duke agreed. Thankfully, there's still nothing quite like a charge of cavalry and footmen in battle.
Sword and honor.
The Imperial envoy added, raising his goblet slightly.
Only those will forever remain worthy for a man to have